Hello, hello, and welcome back to the Heal with Grace podcast. Our guest today explains how ME/CFS is a nervous system and brain response so clearly. So, if you've dealt with any kind of chronic fatigue, long COVID, post viral syndrome, things like that, you have got to listen and save this episode because it will really help you understand actually what's going on and the recovery that is possible. So, Rebecca Tolin is a mind body coach who overcame 13 years of ME/CFS and other debilitating conditions. After seeing 50 practitioners, Rebecca finally recovered through mind body healing. She now helps people with CFS, long COVID, and other neuroplastic conditions reclaim well being, self compassion, and inner wisdom. Rebecca is the creator of the Be Your Own Medicine course, which blends neuroscience with somatic meditation, emotional awareness, brain training, and nervous system regulation. She spreads science and story through her blog and YouTube channel, and you can learn more about Rebecca through her website, which I will, of course, link below. I'm really excited for you to hear this. I actually met her at the ATNS conference. We sat next to each other towards the end. Actually, no, I think it was at the very end of the conference and started talking. And I can attest that she is just as kind and wonderful in person as she shows up here online. Without further ado, here we go. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so, so much for joining. I'm very excited for this episode, especially since we just met in person for the first time at the conference. So it's great to see you here.
It was so fun to meet you in person before we're actually meeting online at the ATNS conference where we were with a whole bunch of other mind body geeks, really, right? And we just got to totally dive into that for 3 days.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
powerful energy to be around everyone in this movement to really help and support people through chronic symptoms. So,
Yeah, and to see how many practitioners are doing this and how much research is showing that it works. And you and I happened to be sitting next to each other, so that was fun to get to meet.
yeah, and I recognized you because I'd heard about your program before, and then I went to your talk there, which we're gonna talk about a little bit here. So, first and foremost, tell us a little bit about you. You've been in this journey for a while and teaching and doing this work. So, tell us about where you are and what you're doing now.
Okay. Yeah, I started out as a journalist and then I got sick after a really traumatic event, which was diagnosed with ME/CFS as well as post-viral syndrome, chronic Lyme, lots of different things over the years, but chronic fatigue syndrome was at the core of it. And I couldn't work or really function in the world much for 13 years. I had to leave my career. I was on disability. I was totally incapacitated. And I tried all these different things, which maybe we'll talk about later. And finally, when I kind of let go of the medical maze and all the things I was trying, and all the practitioners I was going to who were giving me treatments or supplements, I discovered this mind body approach and I recovered. And it was a massive turning point for me in my level of hope and optimism, but also in actually being able to resolve these symptoms that I lived with for so long. So I knew that I wanted to devote my life to helping other people. I had always said, if I recover, I will share that with other people. And the amazing thing about this approach, which I think is very similar to yours, is that you can share it with other people. You know, it's not some drug that has to be prescribed by a doctor. It's like unlocking our internal medicine. So now I teach and coach and write and just help others wake up to this and to their own healing potential.
Yeah. I love that, the unlocking your own potential, right? Your own healing potential because it's true. It's what we're doing. And you're right. I've never actually thought about it that way. We can share this. It's not a prescription. It is that's why there's more and more of us now feeling very called to share and teach this work because it's completely changed some of our lives. So
It's so accessible. And
yeah.
it's so low tech in a way, but there is a lot of science that is showing the efficacy of this work. But yeah, it is something that people that are therapists like you or coaches like me, doctors, physical therapists, or any kind of practitioner can share.
So take us back and share with us a little bit more about 13 years. That's a long time to be, from what I understand, very sick. So tell us
Yeah,
about that.
definitely. So it started with a virus. And I had that quintessential crash that you hear a lot with chronic fatigue syndrome, where I went from being this world traveling broadcast journalist to not being able to walk from room to room in my house. And especially in the initial phase, at times I had to crawl from the bedroom to the bathroom. I was too weak to stand up. The brain fog was so severe, I couldn't remember the name of my best friend. I couldn't sleep, which was really hard to have that tired and wired feeling all the time. So it was like I was always revved up. So I couldn't fall asleep, but I was utterly exhausted at the core. Lots of other symptoms too, with hormones, with GI issues, bloating, constipation, lots of things. And so I did what people do in that circumstances is go to lots of doctors. And especially in the early years, my mom had to drive me around or fly me different places. And we saw different CFS specialists. That was always the first diagnosis. But they just gave me either medications or supplements or prescribed hyperbaric oxygen treatments or different things. And I tried all those things as well as crazy things like someone's Rife machine in their basement or, which if people get better from that, that's great. It's just none of those things actually worked for me. I was on 30 different supplements. At one point for 3 years, I only ate leafy greens and protein like fish or chicken because it was an anti-candida diet. So life had become really miserable, scary. It was really scary because I didn't know what was wrong with me. And they said there was some doctors, and especially a naturopath that I really trusted and saw that was going to be a guiding light out of this. He said, "There's no cure. You have to manage this the rest of your life." And I was in my mid-30s when this first hit, and it felt just like a life sentence. So that went on for 13 years to different degrees. I saw 50 different practitioners until I would say, had a big shift in my frame of mind, and it was letting go of fighting my body, fighting the symptoms, accepting them. It's not that I was resigned, but I accepted them. And I also just let go of trying to get other people to fix me because it was clear that wasn't working. And I actually was like spending more time in nature. I was listening to Eckhart Tolle. I was reading and writing poetry. I couldn't really read much, but I could read a few words. And I just kind of fell into this state of grace, really. I felt like it was a certain surrender that happened, that I was really at peace with myself emotionally and mentally and spiritually. The symptoms were still there, quite strong. At this point, I could go do grocery shopping, but that's about it. I of course, could take care of myself, but that was about it. And from this place of surrender, I met some woman in an online writing class who told me she recovered from MECFS, and her story was so similar to my story. There weren't podcasts like yours back then that I knew of in 2018. And so it was the first person I knew who had recovered and recovered through this approach. And she said, "Rebecca, you're not sick. You're not broken. Your nervous system and your brain are in this hypervigilant state and you can recover." And I was like, "Oh, I just got it. I guess nothing else worked. It was the only thing that made sense." I had traced the trauma back to preceding the symptoms, and I got up and I said, "I'm not sick," filled with energy, and I actually ran around my block, which was such an
Wild.
example of the power of the mind, right? Like when you truly believe you're safe and you're okay and you can recover, things shift. That wasn't the end of the story, but it was more like the beginning of this next chapter.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. I love that. That's such an example, right, of the power of this. And yes, obviously, to your point, I'm sure it wasn't just everything happy and great since from there, but yeah, that's a wonderful example. I love that. What were you told was the cause of your chronic fatigue? I'm curious. I think this can be helpful for a lot of people when they're in this trying to figure it out.
For sure. Yeah. So many different things.
Yeah.
Typically, it was, because it was a post-viral syndrome, they would say it's Epstein-Barr virus. So that was something that rheumatologists and neurologists were especially focused on. Then I was also diagnosed with chronic Lyme. I was diagnosed with mold exposure. And then I got kind of all these other secondary diagnoses like leaky gut syndrome, candida overgrowth. But it just felt like they were pointing to so many different things that it's like, how could this all be wrong in my body? Also the immune system, damaged mitochondria, kind of a lot of the things people are being told still with chronic fatigue syndrome and even with long COVID as well.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I was told many of those, right? And at the time, I actually very much so believed it. I was like, "Oh, okay. All right. Well, there's an answer there." But
Yeah.
treatment didn't really work.
It's encouraging at first, and I can see why so many of us go down all those avenues because someone finally has an answer. And it's like, okay, you take these
Mhm.
things that are going to kill these bacteria or viruses or whatever they are, and you'll
Yeah.
feel better. But then, yeah, for me, I didn't feel any better. And actually, I did antiviral IVs intravenously, and
Mm.
that just really crashed my system. It was so bad. I ended up back in bed. I was bedbound, and the doctor's like, "But look, your Epstein-Barr, titers are down." I was like, "But I can't get out of bed." So that was a clue that this was not actually causing the symptoms, although he thought it was, but the treatment didn't help. No.
Yeah. Okay. So then when you got to this mind body work and you had that I'm literally picturing a light bulb over your head like, "Oh my gosh, I get it now. I'm running around the block." What did you start what was available then in 2018? What did you start doing?
Yeah. What was really available is just kind of after you go to all the allopathic doctors, functional medicine, naturopathic medicine, Chinese medicine, Tibetan medicine. I did all those alternative things because they seemed more integrative. They seemed like they were looking at me as a whole person, but they really weren't because they were still looking at the physical body as being damaged and these different viruses and bacteria as being the cause and just trying to treat those. And those practitioners didn't ask, like, what happened to you? Was there anything stressful that happened before you went from traveling the world in a very high, stressful job, being fine, to not being able to navigate around your house? There was actually one doctor, and he wasn't even in this mind body field. One doctor did ask me what had happened. And then I had wanted him to prescribe these tinctures that he worked with that I thought were going to cure me. And he said, I have a feeling if I give you these tinctures, it's going to sort of reinforce the sense of disempowerment that you're not in control of your body. And I feel that's at the heart of your symptoms because it was a sexual assault that happened before the
Mm.
onset of symptoms. And I just remember Grace like sobbing. He was looking at me and I just started crying because someone did see me. And although I don't believe we're our trauma, when that's ignored and suppressed and there's sort of no outlet of understanding it, it makes it a lot worse. So I knew that he was onto something, but he still worked with supplements. He didn't do emotional work or kind of this neuroplastic work.
Yeah. And so is your conceptualization that the sexual assault was the how do you explain it? Is it the cause? Is it kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back? What is that for you?
Yeah, yeah, I think both. I think it was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was so profoundly stressful on every level, right? Physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I was fearing for my life. And that alone can absolutely put us in that threat physiology and that we don't get out of that. And we store those emotional memories in our limbic brain and they just continue to send signals of danger because there's not that sense of restoration that all is safe now, particularly when those traumas aren't examined. I'm not saying this is true for everyone in the same way, but we all have that kind of, stress barrel or stress bucket where it starts filling up with stress and then it tips over the edge. And at some point, our system crashes. And I think the virus was a stressor on my system as well. It happened shortly after that. My immune system was compromised, but the virus is not what I see as the cause of all those years of symptoms.
Yeah, and that's so commonly what people are chasing because they're told post-viral, right? They had something. COVID now is kind of the big one. Lyme has always been a thing, Epstein-Barr, EBV, and yeah, they're told, "Well, oh, you had that virus and now you have these symptoms? Yeah, okay, so post-viral," right? And at first it might sound like, "Okay, so there's an answer," but they're missing the deeper layer, which is that stress bucket, trauma, emotional stress, mental stress, like that builds up over time. So um, I went to your talk at the ATNS conference on ME/CFS, and you explained it really clearly of how ME/CFS and chronic symptoms actually develop in the brain and nervous system, and you kinda just noted it, but can you walk us through that again? Like, if someone's just starting to understand this and they're like, "How does that actually happen?"
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good point. Now I'm trying to remember how I explained it. Yeah. So, what I've come to understand is that when we go through life stressors, it could be anything from just a series of stressors that are too much for our brain and nervous system to deem as safe and to sort of process in a flight fight mode. Then it could be a trauma, but it may not be. Then our system will go into a freeze state. And I know I've heard you describe this too, that mammals freeze up and play dead. Well, we also have that freeze or shutdown state, as it's called in polyvagal theory. When that happens, there's a perception in the subconscious brain. So this is not conscious. We're not aware of it, but it's the subconscious brain and nervous system that really don't even think you can fight off or run from whatever the threat is in your life. You can't really productively cope with it. And so the system goes into this shutdown response. And it's also very protective in the way that we don't feel as many emotions, where some people will have depression, fatigue, exhaustion, brain fog, all these kind of low energy states. And in a sense, it's protecting us from feeling all these really terrifying emotions at times. And so what happens is then the brain actually learns these neural pathways for symptoms. Just like when we repeat something over and over, our brain learns how to do that without us thinking about it. And it's strange to think our brain can learn that for symptoms. But they've seen in brain scans and in functional MRIs that the brain actually does learn certain patterns and certain emotional centers of the brain become activated and they stay that way with ME/CFS and these other kind of chronic conditions. And then you add to that fear, which is the continued fuel for this threat physiology. And we get that, just because of the symptoms themselves, but also from well meaning practitioners or other people who are facing the same symptoms in social media and they're trying to get help. But that scares us more than we develop these conditioned responses in the brain, these learned associations that this food is dangerous, this person's dangerous, whatever's in our environment or we've been told isn't good for us, the brain starts reacting to. It starts becoming really sensitive to life and lots of stimuli that may not even be related to the initial stressor. And so, yeah, people get really stuck. And I think then when we chase all these physical remedies instead of being able to receive this knowledge that you're teaching, that this is a process in our brain and nervous system, largely because of repressed emotions and emotional stressors. It's not all emotions, it's not in your head, but emotions signal to the brain and nervous system whether we're safe or not. And so it's really important to work on those levels of ourself and to trace back the origin of the symptoms, whether or not you're doing any other physical treatments.
Yeah. I liked how you described how probably the onset of whatever your symptoms are post-viral, the first virus or whatever it is, there's an initial there, but actually what makes it prolonged and probably brings on more and more symptoms is the fear that takes place too along the way because there's trauma within the actual journey of the illness, right? And that trauma creates the fear, the trauma of trying a million different things, going through who knows, spending how much money, right? And
Yeah.
um,
Yes.
yeah, trauma of the journey. Yeah.
Well, right. There's that initial fear and trauma, and then every step in the way, there's more fear often when things don't work. And there's also, grief, and there can be anger and all these other emotions that most of us who get these chronic symptoms may not be aware of because we live in a culture that tells us to just act happy and not really express how we're feeling, or we don't learn healthy ways to do that within ourselves, right? And so that was a really big turning point for me. And I'm sure you see this with your clients as I do, is when we realize that our body isn't damaged and all these different microbes are really meant to live in the body. I mean, I'm not saying there is a time to treat things with antibiotics and it depends on the diagnoses, but I'm talking about for my case, that the fear just keeps the nervous system revved up and it keeps creating these fear ways in the brain, and that perpetuates the symptoms. And so when we can actually realize my body's not damaged, even though these symptoms are highly disabling and real, we can start shifting the relationship with our body and even learning to befriend our body, to bring in self compassion, to bring in courage that, it's okay to start challenging myself and just to bring it, which I think of as self empowerment, and also just bringing in that sense of safety.
That is so true that once you start to really not just recognize, but really believe that you're not broken, right? That actually all the testing you probably have done, which you kind of mentioned earlier, leaky gut, candida, mold, all these things, which I just had a podcast episode out on that because it's something I talk about often. And I was like, okay, we need to talk about this. Those things really show up, but it doesn't mean you need to be reacting. It doesn't mean your body's broken or something's wrong. They're very normal human body things. And I don't know about you, but for me, as I'm thinking about it, I think it was levels of understanding that my body is okay. And almost like I went through different symptoms, kind of grasping one symptom, being like, oh, wait, no, I'm not, no, I'm okay. I'm not broken in that sense. And then kind of keep going through that because it's hard when you went through a 13-year journey of being told something's wrong on all these levels. It's kinda hard to flip it in the opposite direction sometimes.
Well, it is. Yeah, there were times even after I had this revelation where it was like, well, but maybe this supplement would just help me. And if a supplement helps, that's great. It just they didn't help me after trying hundreds and hundreds of supplements. And so it's such a reversal of how we're trained to think in the allopathic medical system. And we grow up in that, right? So where something's wrong with your body. Your arm hurts because you fractured it. And so we need to treat the arm. And so we very much go to there must be something wrong with my body, right? And I've even had symptoms since I recovered occasionally. And it can be like actually before I spoke at the ATNS conference 2 years ago, and there I spoke to the whole room. So it was like 300 people. It was like my heroes and mentors in the field I'm speaking to. I literally turned as red as my shirt. For people that are listening, I am wearing a red shirt, and I'm not kidding. I had red splotches all over my face. I actually looked like a burn victim, and that was a new symptom for me. But I knew it was mind body. I knew it was a stress response trying to protect me. So I did all my practices, and I did take a Zyrtec, and thankfully it went down before the event. But I was at first, I'm like, what happened? What is physically wrong with me? And for about 5 minutes, and then I'm like, no, this is what's happening emotionally. I'm really stressed. Like it's very scary to be so visible in front of the people you most admire. So then I brought in a bunch of self-compassion and, somatic meditations and grounding. And I think that was part of why it went away
Yeah, I
so
can
soon.
completely imagine that. I would have something would pop up in my body if I were about to go speak.
Yeah, right. In front of Howard Schumner. It's like,
Yeah.
gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes sense, and also that's just an automatic thought pattern. Like you said, we've grown up thinking of health in a certain way. So how would we not first try to figure something out, right? What's physically wrong, what's happening? And again, obviously get things checked out if you need to. There might be on
Mm.
certain occasions or depending on what it is. But when you have these skills and tools, it becomes a different journey of looking at your body. Like you said, I was there for 5 minutes. And then I realized, okay, I can help myself. I know what this is, right? That's
Exactly. And in
so
the past,
powerful. It's
right?
so powerful.
It is in the past, I would have been running off to the dermatologist, trying all sorts of different creams and prescriptions, being really stressed about it. And now I feel like I've almost gone the other way. I agree with you. People need to get checked out, and we always should make sure if there's new symptoms that it's not something treatable through allopathic medicine, because if it is, actually you're really in luck typically because there's effective treatments for those things. But I know now, other than my annual exam, I rarely go to the doctor. And I've actually been thinking I should probably just get some preventative checkups. But I feel so empowered to know when the symptoms are mind body that I just don't really go to the doctor that much. Yeah.
The same way. And it took me a little bit to get there. And actually, that's what I wanted to ask you. What did your recovery journey look like from that, kind of aha moment through the next however long? What did that look like for you?
Yeah. I'm glad you loop back to that because For people who think, it was this aha moment, I ran around the block and that was it, but why aren't I responding or recovering so quickly? It really was a journey after that because I had a lot of symptoms and they were quite entrenched. And so for about the next year, it was a number of months, year-ish, I really dove into Unlearn Your Pain by Howard Schubiner. So again, back then there really weren't many
Mhm.
classes or podcasts. And so his book actually does talk about chronic fatigue and a whole range of symptoms. More people talk about chronic pain in our field, but I just sort of applied everything to chronic fatigue. I emailed Howard Schubiner, Dr. Schubiner, and just said, I still am concerned about these Epstein-Barr virus titers because so many doctors talked about them. And he emailed back, he's like, they are not causing your chronic fatigue. They're normal antibodies floating around your system, which just shows you're like 95% of people, you've been exposed to Epstein-Barr at some point. And so that helped a lot. And then I did work with a coach and I did a lot of somatic tracking. So a lot of somatic work for me because I was quite disconnected from my body. I was meditating before this, but it wasn't, it was a mantra based technique, transcendental meditation. So I was still disconnected. So I needed to come into the body with somatic tracking and track the sensations I was feeling through this lens of safety and lots of other somatic work from Peter Levine and pendulating and humming and just started learning a lot of practices. And then I did take some trainings as I was feeling a little better with Howard Schubiner and Alan Gordon used to lead one in person when they were just developing their program. So I got to take one with them and also took, yeah, mind, body, and nervous system and trauma healing and also worked with a therapist at times. And so I felt like, well, it really took graded exposure, though, exposing myself to stimuli again and again and not fearing the symptoms. And I think that may have been the most significant part of my recovery. Because honestly, every time I would step out of my little bubble, I would get pushback. Particularly insomnia. That was my most stubborn, vexing symptom. I lived with it for like 15 years. I needed to some more nuances to overcome that one. But yeah, after those months, I felt like I was back to my life. I was exercising, training to be a coach, then started working, traveling. And every time I would just really reassure myself it was safe and not react to the symptoms. And I started seeing the symptoms as actually a window of opportunity instead of like, I've gone too far. Because with ME/CFS, we're taught to pace. If you get symptoms, actually, the conventional wisdom is like, you've gone too far. You need to go back to your bubble. This flipped everything on the head with this neuroplastic knowledge. And it was like, when you have symptoms, it's a chance to retrain your brain that both your body's safe and also the activity or stimuli is safe by not reacting to it, right? And by telling yourself different messages.
I'm so glad you brought that up at the end because that happens a lot with people, right? Where they're starting to, you know, push themselves out of their tolerance levels a little bit, expose themselves to the different environments that have been fearful. And maybe they crash or have symptoms, whatever it is. And yeah, they're kind of like, oh, I did something wrong or pushed myself too hard,
Yes,
right? And
exactly.
yeah, no, you didn't do anything wrong.
You
I
didn't
feel
do
like
anything
I about
wrong.
that a lot because it comes up often. Yeah.
Exactly, and it's easy to think we did something wrong because we feel so bad, and also a lot of people have been taught to pace, where it's like you're using your symptoms as a barometer of whether you've done too much, and then with this approach, it's the opposite. It's like for me, and I use something called the safe zone strategy, but basically it's a sense of internal safety. How much can you do and still feel some sense of safety, some mindfulness, watching your experience, watching the sensations without spiraling into anxiety? And everyone has a different threshold. We need to challenge ourselves. And so in this challenge zone of this model, we often will get symptoms and we don't necessarily want to retreat. But once it starts feeling overwhelming and we're questioning this whole approach and we're scared and we're just running for the 30 bottles of supplements again, we've just usually gone too far. And it's like, okay, I've got to come back to safety, do some nervous system regulation, play with my pet, be in nature, do something that just resets my system.
Yeah. And I think that's also important. That's different than shutting down. So even from my experiences, I didn't recognize that component where I'd be like, oh, okay, my symptoms are here for a couple days. Well, I just have to wait it out or something. And for me, my shut out or avoid was like binging TV. And I'm just like, well, I'm sick. That's what I'm going to do. But I actually think that like it wasn't helping me. I was just kind of sitting in a bunch of fear, but avoiding it. So resting is a little different. I was saying I'm resting. I wasn't really fully rest, and instead maybe being in nature a little bit, slowing down, taking care of myself, kind of like you said, that's different than just like, "Oh, well, they're here, I can't do anything about it and gotta wait it out." Because actually that doesn't necessarily work either, just waiting it out.
Right, right, because we know with ME/CFS or long COVID or any and even just chronic fatigue, there's no amount of rest that restores your energy. It just doesn't really work, and so, yeah, it's just a whole different mindset, isn't it?
So, what does your life look like now in your physical
Yeah.
body and your mental emotional health? Like how does it feel?
Yeah, I feel great. I feel great. I mean, I dance, I do weight training, I practice yoga, I hike, I do all these physical things that I love that I couldn't do for so long. And body movement is one of my joys. And so to be able to do this movement again and to hike out in nature, which I love, is just such a joy. And I just, I have relationships. I've been able to develop more relationships in my life because before I was sort of isolated, the symptoms would cause a lot of socializing would cause a lot of symptoms. So and then my work is my passion. It just really feels like my life's work to I also lead groups like you and coach one-on-one and just to see people go through this transformation from being disempowered to empowered, from being hard on themselves or critical to self compassionate, and from thinking that they're broken to realizing that they're actually imperfectly perfect as they are, right? And just reclaiming more of our own authenticity. So it's a full life. I work very full time and just feel so grateful to feel in balance again. When I do get symptoms here or there, it's like I know it's because I'm pushing too hard or, a personality trait is now running the show, which perfectionism is my favorite. I still work with that. But I know it's just a guidance to check back in with myself and really see what I need, what I need more of or less of in my life. And a lot of times it's just emotional attunement and connection. And sometimes there is a message. I feel like if I get symptoms now, there's almost always a message. It doesn't just happen randomly,
Mhm.
what I call the wisdom of symptoms.
Yeah. That's when you know you've come far in your recovery. You've gotten to a certain place in recovery where you can see your symptoms from a place of compassion and probably love and as a messenger, um,
Yeah.
because you've done so much inner work with yourself.
Exactly. It took a long time to get there, but now I genuinely do know the symptoms are part of my physiology, just trying to help me, trying to guide me back into more peace and balance. Yeah.
It was a turning point for me where I think it was Howard Schubiner said this in something I was watching, that mind body symptoms are a human response. Everyone has them to some degree, right? Some of us obviously take a little different route, more chronically or severe, but it is a human condition.
Right, and it's so interesting how I think most people know that to the degree that almost everyone can think of having a headache or a stomach
Mhm.
ache, say, after a stressful deadline or an argument with somebody, but it's like we don't make the connection. That can just happen chronically, and our brain just learns those patterns. In some stress cycle gets kind of caught in place, but it's also a reminder to learn some new tools and really to learn the language of our nervous system, which I think is something all children and adults should learn, right? We need it. It's like an operating manual for our own body. And when we go through this chronic symptom cycle, it's an invitation to learn things that we need to stay more happy and healthy.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted one last subject, I guess if you will. Wanted to touch on the trauma piece a little bit because we didn't touch on that, especially in probably how you teach and how you guide people now. How does the trauma component come into it? And I'll give a little bit of a context. Some people can recognize and say, like, yes, I've had trauma in my life, and they're kind of connecting some dots, right? But also some people are like, I don't know what trauma I have. I can't identify anything, right? And I'm hearing all the time that trauma is stored in the body. So how do you explain that?
Yeah. Well, there's a exercise I really like that's in Howard Schubner's book, The Symptom Timeline. And there's others like that that we work with where we really look at when the symptoms started. And typically we're connecting it with just something, whatever physical was happening in our body, but we look at what was happening emotionally. And I would say that's core to my work is with the symptoms, always turning it around to what's happening emotionally when you're feeling these sensations in your body. And so as people go through this timeline of their life, there's so many ahas of like, actually, when I started getting UTIs, I was concerned my partner was cheating on me, or there's some emotional stress that's happening there. And so as people make those connections, whether they would consider it a capital T trauma, small T trauma, or just a stressor, it can help shore up that belief that there's an emotional connection as we learn to sometimes just acknowledge that, other times just support ourselves in a more loving way, how we wish someone else would have treated us. That itself can shift the symptoms. I'm not a therapist, so I certainly don't say that I can directly work with trauma, but almost everybody I work with would self-identify as having had traumatic experiences. And I think especially with people who do have these really debilitating symptoms for a number of years. And I just find that this work, like the emotional piece, but also just retraining the brain and moving back into our life can be the antidote people need. And if they need deeper trauma work, I always recommend they see a trauma therapist. But I don't find everybody does. And I actually don't think the trauma therapy I pursued ever shifted any of my symptoms. It brought some self-awareness, but the symptoms didn't shift that way. They shift through these approaches that we're talking about.
I actually completely agree. Even coming to this work and before doing this as a therapist, yeah, I would always think like, well, trauma therapy is trauma therapy. You have to get there, get to the root, be trained in it and all the things. But what I find is that you can very much so do some trauma therapy and a certain modality, but if you don't have the connecting piece that your symptoms are neuroplastic and it's a brain nervous system response and you connect those pieces, then this alone, trauma therapy alone, doesn't actually shift the symptoms. Might help in other ways,
Yes.
but you have to have that connection. That's what I tell people when they said, well, I've done EMDR, I've done somatic therapy, I've done trauma work, right? Why isn't anything changing? I'm like, you haven't connected the dots here.
Exactly. That's the missing piece is this body of knowledge, which is really now proven in many scientific studies that shows when we go through emotional stressors, our physiology reacts just like it does when we go through physical stressors. And it can learn that pattern and get stuck in that. And so people have to really know my body's not damaged, even though I feel so symptomatic. And that piece is so critical. And then the emotional work could make a bigger difference, right? I also did a lot of journaling. And so I found the journaling and working somatically with emotions in the body really are what shifted the symptoms, along with the behavioral shifts of just starting to live my life and not fearing the symptoms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
makes it all goes together. It really does. And I think that just the educational piece of it, of this is what's happening, that is almost a non-negotiable in this. You have to understand that and educate yourself and learn it and then start using these tools. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what it is. And it is incredible because there's so much free information out there and practices. Some people, they'll contact me and just say, oh, I just watched your YouTube videos and other people's and I've recovered. And it's so beautiful that it's so available. And then some people want more support, but it's a process that happens inside of ourself from the
Exactly.
inside out. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say to someone who's listening who feels pretty hopeless or stuck right now?
I so understand what that's like, thinking you've tried all the things, why try one more thing? And I would say there is hope. There is a way out and don't give up. Keep trying. But notice the patterns. You could do some writing and sort of notice the patterns of what you've tried and how that makes you feel mentally, emotionally, physically. And if those things aren't working, those particular types of approaches, let's just say integrative medicine, try something else. Try something like this that's really working with your internal self, your internal landscape, your mind, your emotions, because it's so empowering. It will change your life in all kinds of ways, in addition to the symptoms shifting. But I would say, keep finding, keep seeking that thing that is going to be your medicine because it's out there and it's actually in here. It's inside of you. My course is called Be Your Own Medicine. So I really believe we all have that. But when you find something and it kind of lights you up, like if you listen to Grace's podcast and you get a little bit of curiosity and optimism, it's like follow that. And if something shuts you down and makes you feel hopeless, but you think you just have to do it, that's not likely to be your healing.
Beautifully said. I love that. Yeah, because we often go down that route because give our power over to other people or doctors. Of course, understandably so, trying to help yourself. I love that you named your course Be Your Own Medicine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we all have our medicine inside.
So tell us about that and where we can find you.
Yeah. So my website, RebeccaTolin.com, is a good place, as well as my YouTube channel. You can also just find Rebecca Tolin Coaching on YouTube. And maybe you have this experience too. There's really something powerful that can happen in a group. Although the groups I lead it is a really in-depth program because I felt like when I first recovered, there just wasn't much out there. And I wanted to give people a download of the knowledge, the teachings, 30 somatic practices, writing exercises. So that's in this Be Your Own Medicine course, which is self-paced or taught as a live cohort. And some people prefer just kind of working themselves, and other people like the camaraderie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work you do, Grace.
You're welcome. I appreciate you coming on, and yeah, talk to you soon.